Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am happy to be with you. I hope you have something fun planned for your weekend, or, relaxing, or whatever type of weekend you want to have. I hope you have some of that in store for you. My day has been pretty laid back. I made pizza for my parents, homemade pizza. One of my favorite things to do, and they always appreciate it, so that's kind of gratifying. And like I said, just a pretty laid-back day, and not much to report from the parents' house here in rural Montana. Well, of course, I do have one great thing to report, and that is, of course, another delightful author that I got to speak with recently. Today I am speaking with Jodi S. Rosenfeld about her book, Closer to Fine. I mentioned the Indigo Girls song at the end of the last episode, and it's been stuck in my head again, of course, but if you aren't a fan of the Indigo Girls, or maybe you've never heard of them, or maybe you have heard of them but you don't know Closer to Fine, anyway, you should go listen to Closer to Fine, because it is a delightful song to just belt out in the car or wherever you happen to be. Just belt it out. In fact, Jodi includes a bit of the lyrics from the song at the beginning of the book. There's more than one answer to these questions, pointing me in a crooked line. The less I seek my source for some definitive, the closer I am to fine. And the closer I am to fine is the best part to belt out. That's one of my go-to belting out Indigo Girls songs. At any rate, let's get to the book. The back of the book says, Closer to Fine is the story of Rachel Levine, a young Jewish bisexual woman finding her adult footing in a world full of uncertainties. Rachel has many teachers along the way. A stubborn grandfather, a progressive rabbi, a worldly girlfriend, a wise supervisor, and an insightful therapist. But in the end, it is her own anxiety that is the best teacher of all. As Rachel learns that accepting that which she cannot control is the mark of true growth, she becomes ever more connected to the people who matter most in her life. So, as I said, that is the back of the book, Closer to Fine by Jodi S. Rosenfeld. It starts out in 2019, but then most of it takes place throughout flashbacks to Rachel's time in grad school in the mid-90s. And I loved that because although I was not in grad school at the same time, I was just starting college about this time, it still felt very, very familiar to me, a lot of the experiences that Rachel goes through. In fact, some of my own experiences in college with religion and the way things were changing in the LGBTQI plus community, I could definitely resonate with in this story. And just, some of the fashion, of course, some of the music and everything. I enjoyed taking that little trip down memory lane. But I also really enjoyed Rachel as a character, as someone who, while of a similar age to me at that time, is very different from me in a lot of ways. So that was fun to experience that time period through her eyes. Opposite sides of the country. I was in Montana at the time. She's on the East Coast. Jewish. I'm Lutheran. She's bisexual. I'm straight. But still, just I went to a very it was called Crunchy then. Do we still say Crunchy? Anyway, in the 90s, it was Crunchy. It was a very crunchy liberal arts school in Montana. And so it was just really fun to revisit that time period. But let's go ahead and turn now to the interview with Jodi so she can tell you more about the book and the writing process and everything that went into it. Again, the book is called Closer to Fine. The author is Jodi S. Rosenfeld. Hi, Jodi. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. It's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it, and I'm excited to talk about your book, Closer to Fine. Before we get to the book, though, if you could share a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you a bit.
Sure, absolutely. I live outside of Philadelphia near Valley Forge National Park, and I'm actually originally from Connecticut, where I grew up on an apple farm. And I left Connecticut when I went to Tufts University, which is outside of Boston. And I lived in Somerville, which is the basic location of the novel. So most of the book takes place in Somerville, Massachusetts, and that's somewhere I lived in my 20s. And after college, I while living there, I stayed in the Boston area and received a doctorate in clinical psychology from the Massachusetts School of Professional Psychology, which is actually now called William James College. And I've lived in Baltimore, Maryland for a while, and now here I am outside of Philadelphia, where I've been for about 15 years. And I would say, to describe myself, I often say that I wear a lot of hats. So I'm the mom of two awesome teenagers. That's part of my identity. I'm, like I said, a clinical psychologist, and I have a small private practice. And I recently became a rabbinical student, which means I'm studying to become a rabbi. And I just started a program at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College here in Philadelphia. And then I'm really excited to be here with you today as an author, wearing an author hat. That's been, writing Closer to Fine was really a passion project of mine for, what almost turned out to be a decade. And I'm so thrilled to finally be, seeing it be birthed into the world has been really exciting.
Yeah, I bet. That's wonderful. You do wear a lot of hats. So
yes.
You were saying that tomorrow is a school day for you as well, so you're starting your studies tomorrow, is that correct?
I am. I just had orientation last week and got to know my cohort, who I'll be spending lots of time with over the next 6 years. And classes do start tomorrow, so that's really, it's a very exciting time for me as well.
Yeah.
My teenagers and I get to, pack our lunches and leave in the morning at the same time.
And they should take a first day of school picture of you.
Oh, that's a great idea. I'll make one of those little signs that says first day.
I love it. So the book is called Closer to Fine, and first of all, let me just say thanks for getting that stuck in my head for the
Oh, anytime. It's a great song by a great duo. I'm a big Indigo Girls fan. And it's funny, the title has, went through many iterations over the course of writing the book, but several of them were quotes from the song, and they were getting kind of wordy, and they were sort of too long to use as a title. And finally, I just said, I'm just going to call it Closer to Fine. It's just sort of captures what I was trying to say, but also, makes in deference to the wonderful song by the Indigo Girls.
And I was, when I saw the cover, when I first got the book out, my first thought was, oh, I wonder if that's an Indigo Girls reference. And then you open it up and, yep.
Yeah, it sure is. It sure is.
Can you share the premise of the story?
Sure. So Closer to Fine is about a young woman named Rachel. She is in her mid-20s, and she's embarking on what today we might call the task of adulting. But the book actually takes place in the 1990s, and I don't think any of us said adulting back then. I don't think that's a term she would have used. But Rachel is coming into her adult self as a young professional, as a Jewish woman, as a bisexual woman, as a romantic partner, and as an adult daughter and granddaughter. So throughout the novel, she actually finds herself in the somewhat unusual situation of becoming housemates with her grandfather, her Zeta. And much of the novel revolves around their sort of shifting intergenerational connection. But ultimately, I'd like to think of Closer to Fine as a story that looks at the question of how we deal with uncertainty in our lives, how we manage the anxiety that that uncertainty brings up for all of us in adulthood. And I think different people in Rachel's life respond to their anxiety in different ways, some through avoidance, some through denial, things like that. But really, it's her journey into how she wants to learn to manage her own anxiety as she becomes an adult.
So there you have a little bit more of an introduction to Closer to Fine by Jodi S. Rosenfeld. We're going to go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about the 90s as the time period, and I'm of course going to go off about the 90s again, just to warn you, but we'll be talking about that time period and the decision to set it in that time period. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back. Hey, it's Sarah here to tell you about the Infinity Pro by Conair with the Knot Doctor all in one dryer brush. I just took this traveling with me and it is amazing in that it is a 3-in-1 tool. I didn't have to pack extra equipment with me just for my hair on this trip. It has a hair dryer. It is a volumizer. It is a detangler. It can do all of these things in one step. The large oval brush creates glam, waves, the bristles painlessly remove knots as you dry and style. It uses ionic technology to create a frizz-free look effortlessly. Speaking of that frizz-free look, there are 3 heat settings plus a cool setting that will lock in your look for effortless-looking hairstyles. It's got a bonus volumizing attachment included that gives you added lift at the roots. And the removable attachments make storage at home or away super easy. Like I said, I just traveled with it and it was so easy and so convenient. If you would like your very own Infinity Pro by Conair with the Knot Doctor all-in-one dryer brush, simply go to conair.com and search dryer brush. Again, that is Conair, CONAIR.com, and search dryer brush.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with Jodi S. Rosenfeld. We are talking about her novel, Closer to Fine. Let's return to the interview.
Yeah, and I love that it takes place in the 90s because it's a little earlier than, she's in grad school when about the same time I was in college, but it's just so fun to revisit some of the things that were going on in my own denomination, my own church life about at that time around LGBTQ plus issues.
Sure.
The alphabet wasn't that long at that time, but it
really wasn't. Right. That's an interesting point. Yeah.
It was really interesting to see it from a Jewish perspective and to see the generational differences because I remember going through similar things in my own college years. And just revisiting, that time period. I liked it.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot. I make a lot of 90s references in terms of music and things things we used to say in the 90s. And it was fun to do that. It was fun to really locate the story in a particular moment in time. And I kind of think that I've been asked this question before, like, could this story take place in a different time period? Could it take place in present day? And one of the things that I came to mind when I was asked that question originally was it would be a very different story if it took place today. One, for the reason you named, like what was happening in the LGBT, Q plus community at that time was that it was really about LGB. It was really if you weren't straight, you really needed to pick a box. You were either completely gay or lesbian, or you were bisexual, and that was kind of the norm at the time. And that affects Rachel in a lot of ways. She's sort of coming to terms with what it means to be bisexual and how she defines that, what it means in her family and what it means, in her religious community. I don't mention trans folks at all in the book. And really that's because in the 90s, the LGBT community wasn't talking about trans issues the way they are now. It really was not nearly as inclusive as it is now. So I think there would be some really interesting things that would be different if it took place, say today.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And so what was your initial inspiration for the book?
I would say, it's not autobiographical per se, but absolutely my own life and my own experiences. I didn't have to do a lot of research for this book because the research was really my own process, my own kind of looking back on what my 20s were like. And while the things that happened to Rachel, to the protagonist, many of them are very different than things that happened to me, I really used my own experience as a young Jewish woman trying to find my voice, and I came out as bisexual in the 90s, and really using my own experiences in those ways to inform the character. So I think it was just about really reflecting on that decade for myself.
Mm-hmm. And I appreciate that there's just the character of Rachel is complex. It's complex in that, she's a young Jewish woman. She identifies as bisexual, but it's not complex in that she's just a person, right?
Right, so right.
You see this person that's struggling with identity and kind of growing into that adulthood. But she can represent people who may not see themselves in books all the time.
Absolutely. So, and I think it's both true that she represents somewhat of an underrepresented voice among characters that we find in novels, but at the same time, there's a universality about her. And at least that's my hope as an author is, when I first started writing the character and writing the novel, my thought was like, LGBT people are really going to resonate with this novel, or Jewish people are really going to, be pulled to this story, or people who grew up in the 90s. I really sort of started off thinking that you had to have something in common with Rachel to really get her story. And by the end of writing it, I didn't feel that way anymore. I felt like, her story, there's a love story and it as part of the plot. And I think there are just commonalities and things that are true about young relationships, no matter who they're between, right? So no matter what the gender is of the two people in the relationship, there's just a lot of universal experience that I think comes through. And in terms of the religious piece, really the struggle there for Rachel is about tradition versus change. And that is something we struggle with in all religious practice, I think. Religions are very, have very traditional, historic roots. And I think, one of the things anyone who practices any major religion grapples with is, how do I be a modern person in today's world and and practice something that is so ancient? How do those two things work together? And often they're in conflict. So in the end, I sort of came to think, you didn't have to be Jewish, and you didn't have to be bisexual to get Rachel. Like, I think her struggles are hopefully more universal than that.
In my tradition, we call it the 7 last words of a dying church. We've never done it that way before.
That's actually, I love that. We've never done it that way before. That's right. That's right. And in Closer to Fine, like I said, Rachel's living with her Zeta. Zeta is Yiddish for grandfather. And, he really represents the way it's always been done. His way of practicing and his way of being in the world is very traditional. And so he likes to do things the way we've always done them. And she really represents change and sort of an evolution and wanting to do things differently. And so the conflict between the two of them, like I said, I think in any religious tradition, or even outside of religious traditions, even in families, right? Across generations, there are ways that each new generation challenges their parents with newness, things that they didn't do in their day. And so there's a lot of that in the relationship between the two of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even with Rachel's mom, you see that some, because her mom really struggles with Rachel's sexual identity, and coming to terms with it, because that's just not what she did, she grew up.
Sure. She doesn't really understand it, and she is a very anxious person. She's a very anxious character, and you see that she's a minor character in the sense that she's not present in the novel so much, but she's actually a very important character, because Rachel really carries her mother's voice around inside her head, and much of what drives her is trying to manage the guilt she feels about hurting her mother in the way that she perceives she has. Yeah.
Time for the second break of the podcast. When we come back, Jodi and I will be discussing Rachel as the main character, so stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Jodi S. Rosenfeld. We are talking about her novel, Closer to Fine. Let's go ahead and return to the interview with Jodi.
You've talked a little bit about Rachel as the main character, but can you just say a little bit more about what else you think about her as that character will resonate with readers?
I think there's something about her being in her 20s. I have a real belief that, and some of this comes out of my work as a psychologist, that, our 20s are just, to me, a fascinating decade, right? There's so much change that happens in those years. And I think one of the reasons is because for most of us, up until the time we're in our young 20s, we've been students, right? Our identity has been as students since preschool, right? So we've always, we've lived by an academic calendar. We've had our summers off. We've known what grade we're going into next. And we sort of know who we are in that way. And then there's something that happens when you graduate college where there's sort of a floundering, I think, and sort of a feeling of like, what do I do next? Who am I? And even though Rachel does start a graduate program, she's really sort of thrust into the adult world in a way that feels really new to her. And I remember myself, people saying to me like, oh, welcome to the real world, and I found that sort of terrifying. I thought, well, where have I been living for the past, 22 years? But there's this sense that when you enter your 20s, you're sort of it's that adulting thing. It's that figuring out how to be an adult in the world and who you're going to be. And so I think the fact that that's the age that Rachel is throughout the novel, she's in her mid-20s. I think that speaks a lot to anyone who's either been that age or is that age, or, I think it speaks to young adults, especially, but even those of us who are older and can look back and think about what we were like in our 20s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that identity piece, I think, plays a big role in the book, because even at the beginning, she has a conversation with friends about, now that we're at college, what is our identity? It's harder to pinpoint that
Right.
at college. Did you go into the writing thinking it would have those pieces of identity, or did they kind of come out of the writing process?
I think that I thought it would. A lot about the writing process came sort of as I was doing the writing. A lot of the plot and the ways in which the plot turned and changed. I often didn't know what was going to happen in a scene until I wrote it. But that piece, the piece about exploring identity, I think that was really at the heart of what I wanted to do when I started. Just really wanting to explore a young woman's experience at that time in her life in figuring out just exactly who she is.
Mhm. Yeah. And you mentioned plot. How about character development? Did you have the main characters or even some of the secondary characters kind of fleshed out before you started, or did that also develop as you wrote?
I think it really developed as I wrote. I'm not a writer by trade, right? Or by I took a little bit of creative writing. I took some poetry writing in college, but it was never my career. It was never really what I was trained to do. And, I'd heard authors talk about their writing throughout my life, like, going to different author talks. And some writers will talk about, having a very clear outline before they begin, or having their characters really fleshed out before they begin. And other writers will talk about sort of discovering who their characters are as they write. And I really didn't know what it would be like for me, but I found that it really was the latter for me, that my style ended up being the characters actually taught me about themselves in the end. So in early drafts, I was sort of surprised to learn certain things about them. And then as I, edited and did more drafts, I had more of a handle of who they were. But initially, no. Initially, they sometimes surprised me with things they would say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did you ever find yourself kind of interacting with them from your psychologist point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a lot of psychology in the book. So one of the things that really gets, I think, explored in the novel is the therapeutic relationship, and from both sides of the couch. So, you get to see Rachel training to become a therapist and what that looks like, and how she works with her supervisor to learn how to be a therapist. And then she also starts therapy with a new therapist. And so we get to see her experience as the client. And so my own work, both my own work in my own therapy and my own work in working with clients, informed that very much. And that's a relationship that deeply fascinates me. There's one part where Rachel is talking with some of her colleagues in her graduate program, and she's saying, like, it's so difficult to be in these relationships where we're not seen. We know someone, your client so intimately. You come to know all the details of their life. You come to know them so deeply and actually build quite a bond with them. And yet you really can't say a whole lot about yourself. Your own needs are not part of the picture. And she sort of struggles with that. It's a different, it's very new for her. So yeah, I think a lot of my experience as a psychologist definitely informed that piece.
Mm-hmm. And you said earlier that a lot of it is from, your own life experiences, but were there any types of research that you found yourself needing to do?
More as reminders than anything else, trying to remember, like, this was before the internet, right? So another thing that's really particular to setting the story in the mid 90s is that it's pre-internet, and that affects a lot of things that happen in terms of Rachel feeling sort of isolated around. She has questions that today you would just jump on Google and figure it out. There are things she wants to know about, feminist Jewish practice and things about women in Judaism that today is available at our fingertips. That kind of information, that kind of access to community, and she didn't have that. And it's funny, after we come to take for granted what the internet provides us. I've almost forgotten what it was like to live before that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so so any research I did was more about reminding myself, like, oh yeah, what year, like what was going on in 1995? Like people were starting to get AOL, like, like You've Got Mail. That was like the closest we had, right? And there were like maybe some chat rooms through America Online, but it was definitely pre internet the way we know it now. And so I had to sort of go back and remind myself, like, oh, what would have been available to her at this time? And what were cell phones like? Did we have cell phones? No, we had clunky car phones, that you had to plug into the cigarette lighter in the car, and so I would say less research than reminding myself what was and wasn't true at that time period.
There's a scene fairly early in the book where the person she's having lunch with offers her cell phone so she can call her Zeta, and she's
right.
like, I use it at the table. Can I do that? Is that
rude? Right. Well, what's funny is so that's actually an early dating scene, which is great. It was really fun to write. And Liz, who ends up becoming Rachel's girlfriend, has been living in France, and so it was true that in Europe they were always a little bit ahead of us in terms of cell phone technology. So when she came back from France, she had this little cell phone in her bag and whipped it out at the table, and Rachel was aghast, like, oh my God, I can't talk on the phone in the middle of a restaurant. Like, how could I do that? And she's like, oh, in France everyone does it, And I thought, yeah, I remember that time where no one would have thought to do something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And final break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll find out if Jodi is planning on writing any more books. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back. Pets bring such joy to our lives, and the GSMC Pets Podcast is here to share in that joy. We'll tell stories of pets finding their forever homes, acting in unexpected ways, being helpful, or just being silly. Whether you love dogs, cats, llamas, reptiles, fish, or you've never met an animal you didn't like, the GSMC Pets Podcast is for you. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Jodi S. Rosenfeld.
This was a passion project, you said, but is it something that you want to do more of? Do you want to write more books? Are you writing more books?
Well, at the moment I'm not. I'll never say never. But certainly starting rabbinical school is taking up all of my time. But one of the great things actually about starting rabbinical school is there's a lot of opportunity for writing, and there's a lot of opportunity for creative writing. So the particular denomination that I'm connected with, Reconstructionism, is really interested in like creating new ritual and new liturgy and like really expanding sort of our creative influences into how we practice. And so I think there's actually going to be a lot of space in there for me to do some creative writing, which feels really great. And I love writing poetry, and there's space for that as well. So that's probably the kind of writing I'll be doing for the foreseeable future.
Mm-hmm. And what actually led you to writing for publication? You've mentioned creative writing and poetry, but what led to this passion project and getting it published?
So I think it was just always a dream, honestly, Sarah. Like I think that when probably going back to my 20s, there are certain things that you sort of put on your bucket list. Again, I don't think we used the expression bucket list back then, but, there were things where I said, like, someday I'd like to do this, and someday, wouldn't it be great to publish a novel someday? And then over the years, bits and pieces of the story sort of were sitting in my brain for many years. Like, I do think I want to write a book one day, and I think it might be about this. And what happened was about 8 years ago, I was on a bike ride with a friend, and I told her this. I said, I've had these ideas swimming around in my head, and, at some point I'd like to write this book. And she just looked at me and she said, why don't you start writing it? Like, well, maybe it's time for it to be on paper. And I kind of went like, oh, right. Why do I keep talking about this as some future endeavor? Maybe the best time is now. And it was just her asking that simple question that sort of shook me into starting. And then it was like, a good 8 or 9 year process from that point of just deciding to start, because, there were different editors along the way and different drafts along the way. And times where I, put it down for 6 months and then picked it up again, which was actually really helpful because, when you write something, you're just way too close to it. Sometimes you need to create a little distance before you can see it more clearly. But yeah, so eventually that was the path.
And from that experience, would you have advice for other people who have that idea in their head and are thinking about maybe they want to write that into a book?
I do. I think I would just be really encouraging. I would say you don't have to be a career author to write a book. It might be harder. You might not have the same experience that others do who specifically studied writing, but if you have a story and you tell it, right, and then just let it go where it goes. I think there are many more opportunities today for publication than there ever were. So there's big publishing houses, right, that we all know about, like big New York City publishing houses, and then there's self-publishing, which anyone can do, and then there are all sorts of small indie presses, which is what I used, a small independent press called She Writes Press, which really champions women writers, especially debut writers. And there's all sorts of new small independent presses that have different specialties or are interested in new voices. And I think, I would just say go for it. There's no reason not to.
No. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
And then you're about to start rabbinical school, so probably your personal reading is going to go way down. But when you have, do you have favorite authors and genres that you turn to?
I do. I read mostly contemporary fiction. And let me think. Barbara Kingsolver, I think, is probably my very favorite author. I also love Jonathan Safran Foer and Nicole Krauss. And I do read a lot of poetry, and I'm a big, huge Mary Oliver fan, which I think I don't know that I've ever met a reader of poetry who doesn't love Mary Oliver, but she is sort of the queen of poetry, or was the queen of poetry, of blessed memory. An Irish poet I love is Padraig Ó Tuama. He actually does a podcast through the On Being project called Poetry Unbound, which is a great way to learn about different poets. And I really do love reading for pleasure. And you're right, there probably will be less of it in my near future.
Yes, and going to assume you're going to be reading a lot more ancient texts.
Right, lots of ancient texts. That's true. Yeah.
And then do you have a website? Where can people find you on social media? All of those good details. Sure.
So I'm not great at social media, but I do have a website, and it's just JodiRosenfeld.com, JodiRosenfeld. And I try to keep up with that, and I use that for a couple different things. I use it for learning about my psychology practice. I have a section on the book and author events, and then some stuff about rabbinic studies also. So it's all in one place. And I would love people to check it out. If people read the book and are so moved and want to write a review on Amazon, that's always a wonderful thing. I don't think you don't have to have bought the book on Amazon. And in fact, I always encourage people to support their local independent bookstores. Mm-hmm. But reviews are great because it just helps give the book more visibility and get it out there. But yeah, I encourage people to please, read it and let me know what you think. And also, my email and stuff is available on the website. Contact me if you want to talk about it or if you have questions or whatever. I think that's always a fun thing to do, to hear from people who've read it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jodi, we've talked about a variety of things in relationship to the book, but is there anything that we haven't covered during our time together that you were hoping to highlight?
That's a hard question because I don't think so, but I'm sort of racking through my brain. What have we talked about? And I think I just want to say thank you in advance to any future readers. It's always a little scary to put your voice out there into the world. It's been really exciting, but certainly not without some fearful moments. And it's a book that I hope people enjoy. I hope people find meaning in. Again, I'd love to hear from you if you're a reader. And I just really appreciate, Sarah, the time to talk with you and be on your show.
Well, I appreciate that you took the time as well, especially now with things, ramping up for the fall and school year and everything. I thank you so much for finding time to talk to me.
No problem. It's an honor to do so.
Thank you once again to Jodi for joining me, talking about Closer to Fine. As I said, I really enjoyed this book as I ranted and babbled. I don't even know what I was going to say, but as I raveled on at the beginning of the podcast, I really loved the time setting, and it just took me back to so many memories of my own college experiences and things that were happening in my own life at the time. So I really appreciated that, and I very much appreciated Jodi's representations of Rachel and her own struggles and her issues, not only with the things that were happening within Judaism at the time, but her own trying to figure out, what it meant to be a bisexual Jewish woman, also what it meant to deal with her own anxiety and going through therapy while also becoming a therapist. Just all those different layers, I really, really appreciated it and could resonate with so many of them, even though, as I said, there are a lot of things that Rachel and I don't have in common, but, that's the wonderful thing about books and characters. There's almost always something that you can find in common with the characters or the storylines in a book, even if it's completely, vastly different from your own experience. So thank you to Jodi, not only for talking to me, but for writing the book and completing that passion project of hers. I hope that you will join me next time. We're switching from novel to sci-fi. I guess it's still a novel. Anyway, we're switching to sci-fi. I'll be speaking with Richard Paulinelli. I'm going to try to get that out correctly. Richard Paulinelli about his new sci-fi book, Galen's Way. Tune in to find out how it's certain authors' answer to Star Wars, and I say authors plural, so you'll have to tune in to find out why that is also the case. If you are a fan of this podcast, as always, please do follow on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I am trying to be more interactive and more interesting, but I do love when listeners hit me up with questions or comments, and I would love to hear from you about your thoughts on books. I love to hear everybody's thoughts on books. Also, if you could take a moment to give the podcast a review, whether that's starred or written, it helps to get this podcast out there to more people who love books, and that is always a good thing. Thank you so much for joining me. Please join me again next time. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I hope, as always, that weekend involves plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast. part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.